Dismissed by the judge, laughed at by the gallery, but Pam Bondi wasn't going down without a fight. Here's how she flipped the script. Pam Bondi entered the courtroom, like she did every day, a quiet determination in her step, her eyes focused straight ahead. The air inside felt thick with expectation. Today was just another day in the battle of wits and words, another case to fight, another verdict to earn. She had been in plenty of courtrooms, faced dozens of judges, and argued against countless attorneys. This was her world, sharp, competitive, and driven by logic and facts. But today she could feel something was different, something in the way the judge had glanced at her as she entered the room. The room was buzzing with quiet conversations. Attorneys shuffled their papers, their eyes flicking nervously between the judge's bench and the defendant's table. Pam's client sat quietly beside her, nervously tapping his fingers on the table. It wasn't the first time he'd found himself facing this judge Nathan Carter, but it was the first time Pam had been hired to represent him, and she knew it wouldn't be an easy battle. Judge Carter was a man with a reputation. He was sharp, perhaps too sharp for some. His decisions were often swift, his tone dismissive, and he had a knack for making those who faced him feel small. Today Pam had been briefed on his history. He was known for his condescension, for belittling those who dared challenge his authority. But Pam wasn't intimidated. She had fought tougher. Battle's court is now in session, the bailiff announced, cutting through the murmur of voices and signaling the beginning of the proceedings. Judge Carter, an older man with graying hair and a face that had seen too many courtroom dramas, settled into his chair. He looked at Pam and gave a quick, dismissive glance, as if to say, "Let's get this over with, Ms. Bondi." He began, his voice cutting through the room. "I trust you're familiar with the case at hand. I don't want any surprises." Pam straightened in her chair, her posture impeccable. "I'm well aware, Your Honor. We're ready to proceed." "Good," he said, leaning back in his chair. "I'm glad you understand the gravity of this situation. Some people don't seem to grasp that around here." He glanced at the opposing counsel, a smug smile crossing his face. "Now let's get this over with quickly. We all know the outcome." Pam's blood began to simmer. The insinuation was clear. He was already assuming victory, and not just victory, but a swift dismissal of her client's case. She took a breath, her fingers briefly tapping the edge of her legal pad. "Stay calm," she reminded herself. This was just a game to him. But for Pam, this wasn't a game. It was her reputation. And it was her responsibility to make sure her client's voice was heard. She turned to face him, the weight of his gaze on her. He was already looking at her like he had all the answers. His arrogant smirk didn't help matters. She could see it in his eyes. He was dismissing her before she even spoke. "You have the floor." "Ms. Bondi," he said in a tone that felt more like an order than an invitation. Pam stood, adjusting her suit jacket, a small but noticeable shift in her stance. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she took a moment to look around the room. The gallery was full, mostly spectators, some of whom had seen this kind of court drama unfold before. They were watching now, eyes trained on her, waiting for the show to begin. And if it were up to Judge Carter, that's all it would be, just a show. But Pam wasn't one for theatrics. She preferred action. With a small nod to the judge, she began. "The facts are clear, Your Honor. The law is clear, and the evidence is undeniable," she said, her voice strong, steady. "The defense claims." But before she could finish, Judge Carter interrupted her. "Miss Bondi, spare us the lecture. I've heard enough of this." He glanced at the opposing counsel and made a sweeping gesture, as if to say, "Let's end this quickly. You're wasting the court's time. We all know where this is headed." The courtroom was silent for a moment. Some of the other attorneys looked at each other, a knowing glance passing between them. Pam could sense the doubt creeping into the room. It was as if they were all waiting for her to falter, to give in to the pressure. But Pam didn't flinch. She just stood there, composed, her gaze unwavering. But this wasn't going to be a routine case. Judge Carter leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of him as he observed Pam. His eyes flickered with amusement, almost as if he were waiting for her to crumble under his gaze. His dismissive tone was like a slap in the face, and the rest of the courtroom seemed to hold its breath in anticipation, as though they had all seen this play out before. Pam, however, stood her ground. She could feel the weight of his sarcasm, the quiet chuckles from the gallery, and the way the opposing attorney, a slick, middle-aged man with a smug grin, appeared to relax in his chair. It was obvious they had already written her off to them. She was just another attorney to be trampled in the face of such a seasoned judge. "You know, Judge Carter said," breaking the silence, his voice dripping with condescension, "this could have been settled weeks ago. There's really no need for all of this theatrics." Pam's heart skipped a beat, but she forced herself to stay composed. This wasn't her first rodeo. She had dealt with ego's arrogance, and the worst of the worst in the legal world. The idea that Judge Carter thought he could easily intimidate her was laughable. "Your Honor," Pam said, her voice calm, But firm, I'm not here to entertain theatrics. I'm here to present the facts. A few people in the courtroom shifted in their seats, the tension in the air becoming palpable. Pam felt the eyes on her, the whispering doubts. But she pushed them aside. This was her moment to prove herself, not just to the judge, but to everyone in that room, to the world. She wasn't about to back down, but Judge Carter wasn't having it. He interrupted her again, his tone becoming more cutting. Let's cut to the chase. The opposing counsel's case is airtight, and frankly, I don't see how you have a leg to stand on. There's really no need to drag this out. We've all seen cases like this before. Miss Bondi, Pam's jaw clenched. But she refused to let his words get to her. She had to remain focused, to stay sharp. If she let him see that his mockery was getting under her skin, he would win, and she wasn't about to let that happen. Your Honor, she began, her voice unwavering. The law is clear. And just because you've seen similar cases in the past doesn't mean this one should be treated the same. There are nuances here, nuances. Judge Carter cut in with a scarf. This isn't some law school debate, Ms. Bondi. This is a courtroom, and I've got a schedule to keep. We're not here to waste time on theories or abstract legal arguments. The courtroom chuckled again, and Pam felt the sting of those quiet laughs. It was clear the judge was playing to the crowd, but she refused to be part of his performance. She wasn't just some attorney he could walk all over. She was a force, and she would make sure they knew it. Pam straightened up, looking directly at the judge. If you'll allow me to finish, Your Honor, I'll demonstrate that the facts you're so quick to dismiss are in fact the very cornerstone of this case. Judge Carter glanced at the clock, then back at her, his smirk growing wider. You have 10 minutes, Miss Bondi. After that, we're moving on. Pam nodded, knowing that the time pressure was just another tactic to rattle her. But she wasn't rattled. If anything, it only made her more determined. She had 10 minutes to prove to the judge and to everyone in that room that she wasn't someone to be underestimated. But the seeds of doubt had already been planted. Would the courtroom finally see her for what she was, or would they continue to believe the judge's narrative? The clock ticked louder in Pam's ears as she stared down Judge Carter, her mind sharpening like a blade. 10 minutes, that's all she had. The courtroom's eyes were fixed on her now, no longer with the same mocking amusement they'd shown moments before. They were waiting. Every second felt like an eternity. Pam didn't rush. She never did. She reached for her legal pad, flipping through the neatly organized pages, as if time were on her side. She wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of floundering. Her confidence was solid, and she wasn't going to let it slip. Your Honor, she began, her voice cool but commanding. You've made your judgment clear, but I ask that you hold off on any decisions until you hear me out. Judge Carter smirked, adjusting his glasses as he leaned forward. I've heard enough, Ms. Bondi. We all have. This is a waste of time. Pam ignored him, focusing instead on the judge's earlier words, the dismissive way he belittled her, the quick assumption that her client didn't stand a chance. She could already feel the courtroom's shifting energy as she started to speak, her calm tone slicing through the tension. There are legal precedents, she continued, that have been ignored in this case, precedents that show the strength of my client's argument. The judge raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. Precedents. The defense's argument is sound, and your claim is based on what exactly? Pam's eyes narrowed, just slightly, calculating. It's based on facts, Your Honor, real facts that the opposing counsel conveniently overlooked. She glanced over at the defense attorney, who was now visibly uncomfortable, his earlier smugness replaced by an expression that was hard to read. Pam pressed on. Your Honor, the case law regarding breach of contract is quite clear. But here's the thing, they've misinterpreted the clause that governs the agreement between the parties, and more than that, they failed to consider the full context of the situation. She could see the judge's impatience beginning to waver. His fingers drummed lightly on the desk, and though he was still trying to project control, there was a shift in his posture. He was listening now, just a little more attentively. She could feel the subtle change in the room, like the weight of their attention had shifted onto her side. Pam continued, detailing the flaws in the defense's argument with precision, citing specific case laws that highlighted the discrepancies. She wasn't trying to win in one sweeping move. No, this was a battle of endurance. Pam was methodically taking apart every assumption, every claim the defense had made, showing not just that they were wrong, but why they were wrong. And as she spoke, the room grew quieter. The once dismissive looks from the gallery were now replaced by the sort of gaze one gets when witnessing a skilled performer in action. Pam didn't flinch. She spoke as if she'd done this 1,000 times before, because in many ways she had lived through moments like this before, when the odds were stacked against her, when people assumed she would fail, and when the room had already chosen sides. The judge glanced down at the papers in front of him, then back at her, no longer with a smear, but with a guarded intensity. Pam had started to win him over, not by force, but by presenting facts, by showing him something he hadn't considered. She wasn't here to pander to his ego. She was here to win this case. And that meant she would keep pushing, keep presenting the evidence, keep highlighting the cracks in the defense's case until there was no room left for doubt. As the minutes passed, the tension in the courtroom started to shift. Judge Carter's face had become more serious, less amused, and even the defense attorney seemed to be taking notes. Pam had caught their attention, but this was far from over. Could she keep the momentum going, or would the judge's arrogance once again derail her efforts as Pam presented her case? She could feel the temperature in the courtroom shifting. The judge, who had once looked at her with nothing short of disdain, was now clearly engaged. His earlier dismissiveness had dissolved, replaced by a subtle weariness. She could see him calculating his next move, weighing her arguments. The smug, confident grin from the opposing attorney had also faded, and in its place there was a furrowed brow of uncertainty. Pam felt the momentous pressure of it all, but unlike most, she thrived in pressure. It was in these moments, when the stakes were high, that she truly shined. The courtroom was quiet now, save for the sound of her voice and the faint rustling of papers. It was no longer just about her client's case. It was about proving a point to the judge, to the defense, and to everyone who had underestimated her. Her argument had cut deep. She had demonstrated with clear and undeniable evidence how the defense had overlooked vital legal precedents, how their interpretation of the facts was flawed. But now it was time to show something more, something no one, not even the judge, had expected. Pam shifted slightly, her hand moving to another stack of evidence she had yet to present. There was a new energy in the room now, one of anticipation, even if it was just a small flicker. She was about to throw her final punch. "Your Honor," Pam said, her voice steady and deliberate, "the defense claims the contract is valid under these specific conditions. They argue that my client failed to meet the obligations outlined. But here's the thing, they've ignored a key factor that changes everything." She paused, letting the words linger in the air. It wasn't a dramatic pause for effect. It was just the way she worked, letting her words have weight. Judge Carter's fingers drummed against the table. But this time there was something different in his expression. The cocky smirk had disappeared and his eyes were fixed on her, narrowing just slightly. "You've heard of the doctrine of equitable estoppel, Your Honor?" she asked, her tone neutral, but piercing. Judge Carter's brow furrowed, and for the first time Pam saw him hesitate. "I'm familiar with it," he replied slowly, his gaze flicking down to the papers on his desk. "But I fail to see how it applies here." Pam could almost feel the eyes of the courtroom turning towards her as she leaned forward slightly, never losing her composure. "It applies because my client was misled by the opposing party into believing the terms of the contract were being met, Your Honor. This isn't just a question of technicalities, it's a question of fairness, and the law protects against unfairness, even when one party tries to hide behind a facade of legality." The tension in the room grew thicker. Even the opposing attorney seemed unsure of how to respond. Pam's words had hit their mark, exposing a crack in their case they hadn't seen coming. And now it was just a matter of following through. She wasn't just dismantling the defense's case, she was showing Judge Carter that this wasn't a simple black and white issue. There were deeper layers to the situation, layers that required careful consideration. Judge Carter shifted in his chair, his fingers still tapping the desk. His earlier dismissiveness was all but gone. His eyes now gleamed with something else, curiosity. It was the moment Pam had been waiting for. "Are you suggesting," Judge Carter asked slowly, "that the defense acted in bad faith?" Pam didn't hesitate. "That is exactly what I'm suggesting, Your Honor. And it's something that the law absolutely cannot overlook." A few whispers spread through the gallery, a wave of disbelief washing over the room. The defense attorney, visibly rattled, now flipped through his own legal notes, perhaps searching for an answer, some defense against this unexpected blow. But Pam had already won this round. She could feel it. The tables had turned, and the judge was no longer dismissing her. He was listening, truly listening, and the momentum was shifting in her favor. But as the defense scrambled to regroup, there was still one last challenge left. Would Pam be able to seal the deal? Or was there one final surprise left in store? The atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted dramatically. Pam could feel the tension in the air, thick enough to cut with a knife. Judge Carter was no longer the dismissive, overconfident figure he had been when she first walked in. Now he was leaning forward, his eyes narrowed with a mixture of curiosity and weariness. His fingers had stopped tapping the desk, and he was listening intently. The other attorneys in the room, once so confident in their assumption of victory, were now visibly on edge. Pam knew she had them all right where she wanted them. The opening round of the case had been a fight, but now it was a war, and she was winning. The defense attorney, who had once been so smug, was flipping through pages of legal references, desperately searching for a flaw in Pam's reasoning. It was too late for that. Pam's strategy had been precise and methodical. Every argument, every piece of evidence had been laid out with care. The cracks in the defense's case were wide open now, and with each passing minute, they were growing bigger. Pam's gaze never wavered as she looked across the courtroom. She could see the growing realization on the faces of those in the gallery, the quiet shift in the way they were looking at her. This wasn't just a case anymore, this was about respect, this was about proving that underestimating her had been a huge mistake. Your Honor, Pam, said, her voice steady, we're not just talking about a contract dispute here, we're talking about a deliberate effort to deceive my client, to manipulate the terms of the agreement in bad faith. And that's not something the law can allow. Judge Carter's eyes flicked to the defense attorney, who was now sitting upright, his earlier air of confidence completely shattered. Pam could almost hear the defense's lawyer's thoughts. He knew that without a solid rebuttal, the case was slipping through his fingers. The once laughable argument was now a looming, insurmountable challenge. He hadn't anticipated Pam's knowledge of the law, her ability to see beyond the surface of the case. Pam didn't give him the chance to recover. She pressed on her words like a steady hammer, each one driving the nail deeper into the defense's coffin. And I'm not just speaking in abstract legal terms. Here, Your Honor, my client was harmed, damaged by the opposing party's actions. The deception wasn't some innocent mistake, it was deliberate, it was a tactic to gain an unfair advantage. And the law is clear on this. Equity must intervene to prevent that injustice from continuing. The courtroom was still now. Even the judge was silent, his eyes on Pam, and for the first time there was no hint of mockery or arrogance in his gaze. Pam knew she had made her point, but there was still one more thing to do. She could almost hear the weight of the moment pressing down on her. As she prepared for her final statement, Pam turned her gaze to the judge, her voice lower now, but no less powerful. In conclusion, Your Honor, what we are asking for is not sympathy, nor is it an attempt to bend the law to our will. What we are asking for is fairness. We are asking for justice, because that is all the law can provide, a means to correct wrongs, to ensure that those who seek to deceive others do not succeed. The courtroom held its breath. Even the defense attorney, who had been so quick to dismiss Pam's arguments earlier, was now quiet. His mouth was set in a hard line, his eyes darting nervously across the room, as though looking for some way out of this corner. Pam had expertly painted him into Judge Carter. His face impassive, looked down at his desk. He was clearly deliberating, and for the first time Pam felt like he was seeing the truth of the situation. It wasn't about personalities anymore, it wasn't about him or her, it was about what was right. The minutes seemed to drag on as the silence stretched between them, and then finally the judge spoke. I'll need to consider all the arguments, Judge Carter said slowly, his voice quieter than it had been at the start of the case, but I'm not blind to the points you've raised, Ms. Bondi. Pam held his gaze, her heart steady. She had done what she came to do. She had put the facts before him. Now it was up to him to see them for what they were. As the judge deliberated, Pam couldn't help but feel the weight of the moment, the culmination of her hard work, her determination, and her refusal to back down. She had just made a landmark case, not just for her client, but for herself. And in the quiet of the courtroom she knew that no matter what the ruling would be, she had already won. But would Judge Carter stand by his earlier judgments, or had Pam's argument truly turned the tide in her favor? The courtroom was still, as if time itself had slowed down. Pam could feel the weight of every set of eyes on her, some filled with skepticism, others with admiration, but none with the same dismissive air that had defined the beginning of the trial. The clock ticked on, each second stretching longer than the last, but she stood unmoving, her posture resolute. Even the gallery, which had once shared a sense of light-hearted detachment, now sat in quiet anticipation. Judge Carter, who had once looked at her with nothing short of arrogance, was now a figure of deep contemplation. He sat behind the bench, his hands folded together, his brow furrowed. Pam knew the wheels were turning in his mind, his earlier dismissal of her argument, now in direct conflict with the reality of what she had presented. The silence was thick, attention that held the room in suspense as Judge Carter's mind played out the case once more. Pam's heart beat steadily, not in anxiety, but in quiet confidence. This was her moment, not just to win, but to leave a mark, to remind everyone that no one could dismiss her so easily. She wasn't here for theatrics, or to prove herself to anyone in particular. She was here for justice. And in this very room, under these very lights, the stakes had never felt higher. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Judge Carter leaned forward. The rustling of papers around the room became the only sound, a sharp contrast to the heavy quiet that had gripped the proceedings. Ms. Bondi, Judge Carter began, his voice low and measured, I must admit your arguments have certainly made me reconsider the evidence presented before me. The claims of bad faith in the breach of contract you've highlighted, they cannot be ignored. Pam nodded, a small but significant acknowledgement. She had known this moment would come. She had known the moment would arrive when the facts would speak for themselves. It wasn't just about her ability to argue, it was about the integrity of the law. She had played her part, but the law had done the rest. The judge's voice cut through the tension again. However, I'm not so quick to dismiss the defense's position. Either the law is at times a matter of nuance. Pam's heart skipped. But she did not flinch. This wasn't the time to react impulsively. She knew Judge Carter was a man of few words, and those words meant everything. She simply nodded, maintaining her composure, watching closely as the judge sifted through his thoughts. "I'll rule in favor of the plaintiff." Judge Carter said, his voice steady, but laced with a subtle finality. "The opposing counsel failed to provide sufficient evidence to counter your claims of bad faith. As such, this court finds in your favor." Ms. Bondi, a collective breath, was released in the courtroom. The gallery remained silent, but the tension had lifted. Pam's client, sitting next to her, let out a relieved sigh. He had feared the worst. He had feared that the overwhelming weight of the judge's earlier dismissiveness would crush their case. But now, as the judge spoke those final words, Pam knew that her persistence had paid off. The defense attorney looked stunned. He sat back in his chair, clearly processing the unexpected turn of events. He had been so sure of his victory. He had expected Pam to falter, to let his earlier mockery rattle her. But Pam hadn't flinched. She had dismantled his argument, piece by piece, forcing the judge to face the undeniable truth. "Ms. Bondi," Judge Carter continued, his tone softer, "now I commend you for your tenacity. Your ability to stay focused, even in the face of dismissal, has proven invaluable." Pam kept her expression neutral, but internally she allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. She had been underestimated from the very start, her abilities doubted. And yet here she was standing victorious in the courtroom. She had proven to the judge, to the defense, and to everyone in the room that she was more than just capable. She was formidable. As the judge wrapped up the proceedings, Pam stood up, her client standing with her. They gathered their papers, ready to leave the courtroom. The battle had been hard fought, but the victory was sweet. She had done what so many thought impossible, not just won the case, but outclassed those who had underestimated her. As Pam walked out of the courtroom, her head held high. A sense of calm washed over her. The case was over, but the lesson was clear: never back down, even when the odds are stacked against you. Never let the arrogance of others define your worth, because in the end the truth always prevails. And for Pam, this victory was more than just a win in court. It was a reminder that no one, no matter how powerful, could dismiss her brilliance.